Today's poem from our anthology is Excerpt from the Prelude by William Wordsworth. Now, in our anthology from the exam board, we get just a short extract, but you can see from this image here that the Prelude is actually a book. It's a poem which is autobiographical in nature and tells the story of Wordsworth's life, right through from his childhood to adulthood. It wasn't actually published during his lifetime and was only collated and published after his death in about 1830. At the time, it was critically received quite poorly, and people didn't think that some of the subjects that Wordsworth wrote about were suitable for the idea of poetry, perhaps not noble enough. But it's since come to be seen as an incredibly important piece of English literature. In fact, even at the time, Wordsworth was one of the most influential of the British poets. In 1798, he published a book along with another poet called Coleridge called Lyrical Ballads. And this was a collection of poems that both poets had written that dealt with the lives of ordinary people. And that was a huge change in what British poetry normally wrote about. Beauty, kings, queens, and in this little collection of poems, Lyrical Ballads, Coleridge and Wordsworth write about the everyday lives of ordinary people, deeming those as valuable a resource for literature as anything else. So an incredibly influential man, quite revolutionary in his youth, a supporter of the French Revolution for a long time, although it did come about that in later life that he became much more conservative and his politics were much more patriotic, and he even took a minor job working for the government. Wordsworth was incredibly influential on some of our later Romantic poets. Byron and Shelley were influenced by the early Wordsworth, although both of them criticised him for his change of politics later in his life. As usual with these poems, I've tried to give you some images. So we've got people ice skating on a frozen lake, which, as you know, this poem is about. And we've got this picture of hounds chasing a hare. And we'll come to that later as we go through the poem. Okay. So if you already know this poem, then without using your notes, pause the video now and answer these three questions. Then start the video up again and check your answers as you watch through the video. As I always explain, this is the most powerful way of revising. Little tests for yourself to force yourself to recall that material under a little bit of pressure, exactly like you'll be in that GCSE exam hall. So these little ideas of revising in this way with little tests are incredibly useful for you. Okay, remember to pause the video as I'm going through and use those pauses to take notes. You'll find a layout for your notes on the next slide, but some of you will be familiar with that already. And remember, you can use the images to jog your memory and fix stuff in your long-term memory so that you have that information ready to recall. And like I've always said, test yourself regularly. Okay, here's the layout. Remember, as with all the other poems, the Prelude is a lot more complicated than this. Even the extract that we look at has got far more levels of complexity, but this will be more than enough for you to write about in your GCSE exam. You have 20 minutes to write about the poem, so there's a limit to how much you can cover, and this will be more than enough for you to get a really good mark. Okay, the context. Wordsworth was one of the Romantics, one of the early Romantics, not quite as early as Blake, but certainly came before Byron and Shelley and Keats. He valued, as did other Romantics, nature, the imagination, and personal freedom, and this kind of idea of not being, people not abusing their power, no tyranny. And that's why Wordsworth was initially a supporter of the French Revolution. In 1798, he produced this little volume of poetry called Lyrical Ballads, which really changed the way that British poets were looking at subjects for poetry. No longer were these typical poetic ideas, but Wordsworth's writing about people who work on farms, people with ordinary everyday lives doing mundane tasks, and Wordsworth and Coleridge deemed that suitable material for poetry, which caused some controversy at the time. Wordsworth was very opposed to the Industrial Revolution, especially if it impacted on his beloved Lake District. He was born there, grew up there and returned there. I mean, he didn't like the encroachment of industry on the Lake District and nature, and he even campaigned against a railway being built across the Lake District at one point. Remember that the Prelude is autobiographical. It is about Wordsworth's life. That is some of your context for you. You can simply write about this being an autobiographical poem, and that the events in there reflect events in Wordsworth's own life. So quite a long poem, which I'm actually going to break into parts. And the important thing about this poem is that the form of the poem is incredibly important. So long poems like this, which are book length, are called epics. And traditionally epics are about heroic events, kings, queens, knights, dragons, or, you know, these kind of George and the Dragon, Sir Arthur, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and those kind of things. But in this poem, Wordsworth writes about his own life. And again, we see him using this form deliberately to emphasise that an ordinary life like his is just as valuable, just as important, and just as worth writing about as the life of a king and queen or some hero from a fairy tale. So interesting that Wordsworth chooses this epic form to emphasise his political point about an ordinary life. Okay, I'm taking the top half of the poem first, and you can see that I've picked out certain phrases. I heeded not their summons, it was a happy time, a time of rapture, I wheeled about proud and exulting, we hissed along the polished ice in games confederate, and woodland pleasures. And you don't have to know much about poetry to realise that the language here is the language of pleasure. This shows someone enjoying themselves in nature, even though it's the frosty season and the sun is going down. So it's winter, it's cold, it's frozen, it's getting dark, but this person is absolutely enjoying themselves. And the language of pleasure is dotted through the top half of this poem. And we can see that the speaker is enthusiastic and passionate about what he's talking about. He's really enjoying himself. He doesn't want to go home. He describes it as a time of rapture or extreme happiness. And there we see that image of people enjoying themselves ice skating on a frozen lake. And then I'm just picking out a few bits here. Like an untired horse, obviously you know that that's a simile. And here we've got imitative of the chase. Notice the different spelling of chase. We would now use C-H-A-S-E, meaning a hunt here. Woodland pleasures, the resounding horn, the pack loud bellowing, and the hunted hare. So he compares himself to an untired horse, a horse with loads of energy, and he compares himself and his friends to a pack of dogs and a hunted hare, picking out natural imagery to link himself to show his enthusiasm or excitement. And we see that he equates the idea of the enthusiasm and energy of nature with being young. When he's young, he links himself, like I say, to a horse, and him and his friends to the dogs and the hare, and he associates that with the energy of youth. So there's your second language point, the use of comparatives, simile and metaphor to show that youth is much closer to nature. And there we've got that image of a pack of dogs chasing a hare. Okay, the final language point comes from the bottom section of the poem, and now we have leafless trees mentioned, and icy crags, and alien sound, and melancholy, and the orange sky of evening died away. And we can see a change in the tone of the poem here. The enthusiasm and passion has gone, and instead we're faced with, you know, language that is quite negative. The word melancholy, and the trees are now leafless, and which seems to be suggesting here that something is coming to an end. Now, what could be coming to an end at this point in the poem? Well, it could be an end to the innocence of childhood, like we saw in Heaney's poem Death of a Naturalist, obviously written at very different times. It could be the end of a rural way of life, because we know that Wordsworth was opposed to the encroachment of the Industrial Revolution on the Lake District. So we've got this idea of something finishing here. I think that we definitely can see the innocence, the loss of innocence of childhood from the change of tone in the poem. But I find it interesting that tinkled like iron, and we associate the mining of iron ore and coal with the Industrial Revolution, and an alien sound, a sound that had not been heard before, possibly the sound of the Industrial Revolution encroaching on Wordsworth's life, or the sound of future responsibilities as an adult encroaching on his childhood. So, but we definitely have a turn in the poem. We call it a volta, and it happens around about this point where it says meanwhile, and there's a change in the tone of the poem for a more negative aspect. So the structure of the poem. The poem's written in something we call blank verse. That's unrhymed iambic pentameter. So we've got 10-syllable lines that don't rhyme here, and that mirrors the patterns of everyday speech. Again, epics would traditionally have been written in rhyming couplets, but here Wordsworth wants to show that this is about somebody who's an everyday person, and so he's going to write his poem in a way which mirrors just an everyday speech, just an anecdote being told. So there's your first structural point. The poem's written in blank verse, and that mirrors the patterns of everyday speech. The second structural point, I think, is really important that we pick out this word "and," the first word in the poem. And you're told frequently by your teachers that you can't really start a sentence with "and." And here, Wordsworth starts this section of his poem with "and." And we have the word "excerpt" from the title. Obviously not the title that Wordsworth gave the poem, but the title we have now. And that tells us that, that this is part of a longer poem, and implies that something happened before. But one stanza here suits the idea that this is one memory, just one memory, with a memory before and probably memories afterwards. Well, we know memories afterwards because the Prelude is a long enough book. But we've got this idea that it's part of something longer, and one stanza suits the idea of an anecdote for one memory. So there's your structural points. And remember, the Prelude, book-length poem, hundreds and hundreds of these stanzas. Wordsworth in this poem then, the poet's thoughts and feelings, shows us that the everyday lives of ordinary people are worth writing about. They're valuable in their own way. And we see that the speaker values everyday life as much as he values typically of a romantic nature, and he sees childhood as a time when people are closer to nature. The speaker hints that something is ending towards the end of the poem, and this is both the ending of his innocence and his childhood, you know, where there's lack of responsibility, but also an ending of a certain way of life in Britain as we move towards a more industrial age. And the poem makes the reader think about the changes in their own lives and how they've changed since childhood to adulthood. And we can understand the point of view of the speaker in this poem, who shows us that he's changed and lost something from when he was young. The poem expresses similar ideas to Death of a Naturalist, and actually, while there are only one stanza here and two in Death of a Naturalist, we see this change in the poem from the innocence of childhood to the experience or more mature approach of adulthood, and people drawing away from nature and being less linked to nature as they get older. An incredibly important piece of poetry, the Prelude, and I hope that came across in this video and that you found it useful.